Hello and namaste. This is your host, the incorrigible Mr. Zeppo. And that is the wrong music playing for this segment. I should have been playing a different track because this is an episode of Breaking News. This is not an episode of Almost Daily Zencast, but that is coming right up. And I guess I'll maintain the theme and play something random on that segment too that is not its actual theme music. All the theme music, by the way, is music that I discovered on freemusicarchive.org. That's a totally genuine and honest endorsement for the site. No one's paid me to say that. It's a cool collection of music that artists have put into the archive for people like you and me to use for free under slightly different technical clauses because each one is published with a particular license. But go check them out. They're very clear and straightforward. And that website rocks. Rock on. Okay, my friends, here we are. Here's my favorite headline, or rather news item of the week that didn't really break through the surface. I saw one or two references to it throughout the entire week, and I thought it was one of the biggest bits of news. And I don't even think this might be from last week. I wrote this down, and then I totally failed to bring it up in several sessions of recording in the last couple days. So forgive me. It's something I meant to talk about a lot sooner, and that's why I called it Putin Trumps Trump. Because Putin, there was a bit of news about Vladimir Putin on the same day that North Korea launched its most recent ICBM test. And I know there's been several lately, so this makes it fuzzy to remember exactly when. But I'm pretty sure it's the last one. The one that went really far up high, although it didn't go very far out into the Sea of Japan or wherever it is it landed. It went remarkably high. Enough to qualify at the latest assessments, capable of reaching Alaska and points, towards the mainland, towards Canada, although everyone's not entirely sure. But on that same day, during that ICBM test, as the American news media was hyping all this saber-rattling, what are we going to do? Are we going to get into war with them? Are we going to apply pressure to China? Trump's going to, what kind of big deal can Trump... Blah, 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 blah. Putin himself and the president, actually, I didn't write down whether it was the president or not. I seem to recall by memory that it was the president, but it might have been someone else, some other functionary from the Chinese government. But I saw the image there. Putin signing a deal with China, banning North Korean missile tests, and banning any further U.S. and Japanese military exercises in the Sea of Japan. Also, this deal was requiring the end of the U.S. missile defense program in South Korea. And wowzers, if that shouldn't have been bigger news all week long than it was. Instead, they kept showing us the missile launch, and then our own Japanese-American joint, counter show of strength missile test launch. We're launching all these tubes of metal with hundreds of thousands of pounds of toxic waste fuel up into the air and into the oceans just to prove who's more badass, bigger cocked than the other, I suppose. Never mind. Here's multiple things to try to unpack here. Quick note, has anyone stopped to address the issue of how much toxic waste these military exercises dump into our water and into our air? I know that there's people out there who realize this, but for those who don't, the military, the U.S. military, and if you combine all the militaries of the world, I'm sure that this remains valid. In fact, it probably gets worse. But military activities remain the least talked about and most aggressive contribution to pollutants in our atmosphere, period. Above and beyond everything else that we're worried about, the use of military, all kinds of military activity from, I don't even think that this assessment was made by somebody, God bless it, don't have a source right now, but I'm sure if you tried Googling it, you'll find the same kinds of things I came across. I'm pretty confident, I could be wrong, but I'm pretty confident that this assessment is valid, that it's true, that it's like the least talked about thing. We don't talk about how much pollution is generated by our active wars that continue, because we've been at war for 224 of the 229 years we've been around or whatever. Those numbers are probably totally inaccurate. But you know that I've talked about this before. We've only had 22 years of peace, the entirety of the existence of the United States of America. And most of that, has been in kind of postmodern conditions. Think about how much waste has been pumped into the air you breathe, the water you drink, and the food you eat. Because yes, my friends, pollution anywhere, if it's circulating, will get into your food, no matter where you buy the food. Because it's all one intra-connected system, folks. You can't pretend that if you paid extra for supposedly healthier food, that it's free of the junk that's just floating everywhere. It's not. It may be GMO free, but it sure as fuck ain't going to be free of, the last 50 years of toxic waste that's been floating in the air and running through the waters and landing on the earth. So never mind that. Let's get back to this particularly strange agreement. Where does that leave Donald Trump? And mind you, this happened before the meeting in Hamburg, or wherever it was, at the G20. Yeah, that was in Hamburg, right? Okay. And not much has been talked about it. Instead, our media echo chambers on the left and on the right have been hyping up the little bit of reactionary military strength, show of strength stuff that we have gotten away with doing. I don't know when this agreement was intended to go into effect, but it's there, and that's something that's gonna come up later on. And it's quite fascinating that this agreement puts us in a position of submission to the interests and the will of of Russia and China. Something that Trump pays a lot of, lip service to saying he's not ever going to let happen. But this deal happened at least 5-6 days before Trump met Putin. Was there any discussion of it? Not that we're aware of. Would any other president of the United States be aware, who was aware of this kind of deal that puts us in a, disadvantage militarily in relationship to North Korea? Would any other imaginable president have said to that same, Vladimir Putin, that it's an honor to be with you, if he'd been aware of this deal just, days before being struck with China? No. And mind you, what did President Trump actually do? He blamed China. He sort of rose at me. Oh, poor China's not going to step up to help us. But ironically, there was no acknowledgement from Trump that China is indeed stepping up to help Putin. So this is why I call this particular segment breaking news. And what I mean by that is that sometimes the news itself, as reported, breaks the news as a whole, because it becomes patently obvious that while they're making some effort to pretend to be, investigative, and to bringing out the truth and to keeping us well informed, and there's a lot of lip service paid to transparency and, the civic duty of the press, they clearly don't tell us everything they could be telling us. And then they obviously pick and choose what bits of news to back off of once it becomes clear that it's part of a larger issue that they don't want to address. So yeah. For example, to be sort of to zoom out and take a broader picture, let's not obsess about Putin and North Korea right this second. But let's talk about a little interesting factoid. These are the 2 fun factoids that I've discovered and came across and seem to be true. I could be wrong. It is feeling increasingly difficult to verify and fact check things. You kind of ultimately have to take somebody's word for it, because you end up at some site that says, yes, I verified this, and there's kind of the breadcrumbs die out, and there's no other way to dig deeper and verify, at least not as a civilian, with a computer and the internet as their primary tools of trying to verify. But this seems to be true. Having said all that, Mitch McConnell, who, despite sometimes expressing disagreement with the president in different ways, is also sort of taking up the mantle of, fake news and perpetuating ideas that are just inaccurate. Here's a fun thing that most GOP supporters don't understand. He had more to do with the blocking of a public announcement of the Russia intervention back in the day when it was discovered. Remember way back last year when it was indeed kind of quietly reported by the Obama administration? They made an announcement. By the way, guys, we kind of think only in writing. They didn't take to the TVs. And why? Because the GOP, led by Mitch McConnell, made a big hubbub saying, whoa, don't announce that. Don't announce that. No. And they as much as they love to call now the Democrats the obstructionist, the GOP has an 8-year track record of nothing but obstructionism. And at the end of that 8-year term, I think was just all kinds of caught up in the addiction of, and you can see it now that everything across the board is under the control of the GOP, they still can't help but obstruct themselves. At any rate, when the Obama White House was first sort of beginning to say, hey guys, we need to make a decision about this and we gotta come to terms with it, make some sort of announcement, even though we're worried about it seeming to come across the wrong way in terms of meddling in our own election. Mitch McConnell apparently had a lot to do with the postponement of the release of that information, the way it was muted down. And now, of course, the GOP, following Donald Trump's crazy lead, is blaming Obama for inaction, quote unquote, which is nonsense. He definitely did take action, but they were the ones that were preventing the announcement from going public. And now, and since then, since all of that shit has hit the proverbial fans even harder, you see the GOP sort of tearing itself apart because it can't decide whether it wants to take a stand to defend the first, strong GOP president in the White House during the first, time in a long time in relatively recent history, where the Republicans have controlled all the significant, branches of government, or whether they should really sort of stand up for their own supposed ideals and moral values and take a stand against this president, which is pushing both the GOP and the DNC and all of America into a Trumpopian direction of crazy that it seems almost no one in office has that's not true. Very few people. There's plenty of people who are opposing the president in office. But no one in his own party seems to have the strength, even those opposing him or occasionally speaking out against him, no one has the strength to go as far as it could possibly go. To say, hey, whoa, what the hell, man? But I guess that's increasingly changing. That's gently changing as we go. This week's news with the the fallout from the big trip. It's Sunday, so I'm waiting. There's very little news going on. It's all kind of rehashing this past week's news. I am going to check in a little bit after noon in terms of turning the TV on and all that. But this deal with between Putin and China and North Korea is, I think, wild, and I think it's going to set up some future conflicts. Now, if we zoom back, the biggest breaking news is the oldest breaking news. The profiteers want to keep profiteering on global conflict and wars as much as possible. That's the breaking news of the day, folks. That's what's going on. Do you ever scratch your head and wonder, like, what the fuck? Oh, right. War is the most profitable thing that humans have invented. Mind you, we invented profit, too. It's like it doesn't exist in nature at all. Show me in nature where profit exists. Show me in nature where profiteering exists. It doesn't. We might over-personify or over kind of, what is it when you attribute conscious attributes to an inanimate object? Not personified, but it's just like personified. Anyways, we might overdo that and sort of try to call some behaviors in nature that animals or plant life participated in profiteering, but it isn't really, because they don't have an imaginary, symbolic system of commerce by which they're really legitimately profiteering. That's one of the things that separates us from the rest of nature, is that we are addicted to these imaginary constructs that we invent. That's the big breaking news, folks. That's what's really going on. That's what's been really going on for the vast majority of what we call human history. Obviously, there's a lot of missing chapters there. We've limited our own comprehension of our history, our true history, for the sake of perpetuating this endless profiteering on, in sort of endless conflict. I hate to sound like a broken record, but that's the most urgent issue of the day. And how to solve it. And this is where we all lose our shit. Because first of all, it's hard. It is really hard to come to terms with the fact that almost every cultural, societal, and religious institution out there has been tainted by this corruption in one form or another. I very blanket statement, the whole thing and say everything's been hijacked. Everything you love has been hijacked by the war profiteers. Your religion, hijacked by war profiteers. Your sports team, hijacked by the war profiteers. When did they do this? Oh, long before most of these structures even existed. When did the global war profiteers realize that war was profitable? Probably the very, as far back as before. I'm pretty confident that the system, as we know it today, its roots go to the era that we sort of don't really know a lot about, before all the stuff that we hear about before the Tower of Babel. Because most of that gets sort of trimmed down into some imaginary faith-based history that leads us directly to the Garden of Eden and ignores whatever the fuck actually happened in terms of the sort of national consciousness here in the United States, because no matter how many independent thinkers disagree, and I respect that because you're right, but this country is operated de facto by those who are in charge of it as if it were a quote-unquote Christian nation, because that's part of the brainwashing. Anyways, I digress. It will be interesting to see what kinds of consequences come out of this increasingly bizarre relationship that we are allowing to be redefined. We're allowing our relationship to another country be redefined by ideas that we're not even really sure where they're coming from. And I'll wrap up my breaking news with a couple of other interesting things that I want to always bring back to our attention because they don't get discussed. I'm pretty sure we're going on over a year now that the mainstream media stumbled into the Panama Papers leaks, thought it was interesting, talked about it, and then buried it deep. They haven't talked about it for over a year. If you've never heard of the Panama Papers leaks, go dig it up and sift through the analysis of it, or sift through the leak itself for your own comprehension. It's epic. It's lots of documents. But to the best of my understanding, what I have gathered about the Panama Papers leaks, which may or may not be the most accurate interpretation of it, of the data, because I didn't personally sift through the reams and reams, endless online pages of documentation, but others did, in theory, for the purposes of uncovering the truth. And this was the most interesting analysis of the Panama Papers leaks that came out, and then just sort of disappeared. No one's talked about it since. Not anyone that I've come across, anyways. That doesn't mean no one. I guess I haven't seen any chatter about this recently. But that there's money, massive. We all know that Putin is epically rich, right? In fact, CNN recently had a special, and I sat through a portion of it just to get a sense of its general zeitgeist. What was its general sort of character? What was it? How was it addressing the situation? And if you understand doublespeak and the way inculcation works, brainwashing is not what most people think, which is the direct. It's not as obvious as dogma, and in fact, brainwashing often presents itself as the opposite of what you would expect, which is sort of an open-ended, thoughtful discussion of maybe these things are going on, sort of without getting trapped in a rabbit hole of discussing what brainwashing actually is. This show on CNN repeated the idea over and over again in multiple ways and on different angles, and this is what inculcation means. Planting the seeds to let people just sort of absorb something without them really realizing that they've absorbed it. That Putin is the most wealthy man on the planet, and therefore, and also simultaneously, the most powerful man on the planet. Is that true? Probably not. As I've stated before in other episodes of Good Morning Trumptopia, and I'll integrate here, let me break some news to you. I don't care how wealthy they are. If they have exposure to being publicly recognized, in other words, journalists have gotten photographs of them, or, we've been able to investigate their lives and get some understanding of who they are and what they are and where they come from, then they aren't the wealthiest people in the world. And they aren't the most powerful people in the world. Because understanding the exponentially, addictive course of power and money, the ones that are truly the most wealthy in the world probably live in complete and total, secrecy. They probably exist amongst us in almost total invisibility. Because if somebody's this wealthy, how naive is it to think that someone couldn't be wealthier than them? Especially if they're up to nefarious things. They wouldn't want us to know who they are, would they? Shocking thinking, right? Everyone's angry. For example, I try to point this out to individuals, regardless of their particular political or ideological identity. If they're out there speaking against, for example, the Rothschilds, which are considered to be, one of those they're the elite. They're the 1% of the 1% of the 1%. That they are the wealthiest of the wealthy. And yet we have photographs of them from various, things, and we've got some insight into their lives and into, biographical events, and we have some quotes from them. Let me tell you, if I was the most wealthy person on the planet, and based on my understanding of wealth, power, and greed, and how that, infects and corrupts the human mind and engenders sociopathy, I would probably have thought all that shit out and have people out there like the Rothschilds or like Putin to be the scapegoats and the poster children of the overall agenda. Because if no one ever knows who I am, and no matter what happens to my surrogates, I can keep advancing my agenda. I just need to replace the surrogates and the scapegoats on the front lines, right? So yeah, Putin may appear on the world stage of publicly accessible, open sourceable sort of he's known individual. He may appear to be sort of up there. But to connect us to the Panama Papers, as the Panama Papers indicate, even he is getting money from some other source beyond his own sort of corrupt abuse of his country's resources. Okay? Because according to the Panama Papers, there's a network of tax-free offshore accounts in various kind of Cayman Island style. Isn't the Cayman Islands where all those different places in the world where you can have a quote unquote offshore account that respects your privacy to the extreme, to the immoral extreme, so that you can sort of, I hate to use the word, but not I hate to use the word, but I know that to some people this would be extreme, inaccurate, but you're basically laundering money at that point, right? If no one can trace where the money came from, and then you can gently and quietly tap that money and introduce it into your own flow, then you're kind of laundering money for someone. But if Putin has an account like that, where money's getting pumped at him from some source, then that source is larger, deeper, more occult, more scary, and more secretive than he is. And I'm pretty darn sure that if their names have been in the news, or if the names have been exposed enough that there are conspiracy theories floating around openly on the internet, then they aren't the tip. They aren't the core of the thing, They aren't the root of the problem. They're just the tip of the iceberg. They're the pokey thing above the surface that distracts us from the much more dangerous chunk of, whatever the fuck is below the surface. Who knows? Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe the people we've already identified that have already... I had nothing to do with it. Maybe the people that have already been identified by the conspiracy theorist movement as those who run the show, maybe that's really them. But I find it naive and silly to think that their image would be allowed, to circulate and to be known by the rest of us who are the fodder for the meat grinder that they are operating. Because I hate to break it to you folks, all of our postmodern society is a scam, and the simplest analogy for it is we are being seduced into a meat grinder. We are being seduced. We are being sold a reason to willingly walk into a meat grinder so that they can grind us up and spit us out and profiteer on that process. And whoever's doing it, I think, is that much more powerful and that much more wealthy and that much more sociopathic than any of the people that we know of. I have no evidence for that, other than it just makes a lot of fucking sense, right? And that, connected to the notion of Hydra's head, as I was talking about in my previous segment, it would make sense that that which we could attack, because we could have a revolution where we attack all known government leadership. But would that solve the problem? Would that really solve the problem? What if we got hardcore and went French Revolution style? And I'm not making the threat. I'm talking about the theoretical, and I'm advocating against the following notion. Let it be clear. I am a firm believer that a bloody revolution is a trap. Let it be clear that I think whoever gets allowed to be put into office are put there to exercise the will of others, and that anytime a revolution does happen, they're the first ones sacrificed. Do you understand? That's what I meant by you can't cut off Hydra's heads. So it's not worth it. There's no gain there. There's no liberation there. There's just kicking the can down the road and getting tricked into believing that the next generation of leaders are going to fulfill the will of the people as opposed to the will of those who are continuing to profiteer on us, because we missed them entirely, because they weren't any of Hydra's heads. They're the person who controls the Hydra beast. To add a layer to my analogy from a previous segment. You know what I'm saying? Like, everybody let me break some news to you folks. If you are caught up with violence and a desire to burn the system, destroy it, to kill everybody, all that, you're wrong. You have been seduced into being part of the problem. Because those who own and control the Hydra beast are putting the Hydra beast in the way of your violence on purpose to keep you busy. The way we keep little children busy with busy work. Okay? How do I know this? I don't. I don't know this for a fact. I can't point to any conspiracy theory, that backs me up. I don't know. And maybe there is already an existing conspiracy theory movement that's stating this, as opposed to some other conspiracy theory that points to individuals that are known, to the world via images of their actual person. But I think it would be naive to dismiss the theory I've just shared, just because it changes what the best approach would be for the resistance. You understand what I'm saying? The resistance needs to occur, but the revolution that needs to happen, the revolution that the human being, the human species, is desperately wanting, is a revolution of the mind, a revolution of the spirit, a revolution of the body, not a revolution of guns and war. We need to, those of us who already comprehend this nuanced distinction, we need to reach out to our brothers and sisters who are wrapped up in anger and frustration so tightly that they cannot help but spew hate and prompt violence. That's the most important news of the day today, I think, in my humble opinion. That before we can succeed in the revolution that is necessary, we need to heal ourselves as much as possible first. Where does that begin? You cannot sit around waiting for someone to heal you. You must heal yourself. And I mean, obviously, if you're suffering from some horrible disease, then yes, go to the doctor. I'm not talking about that kind of healing in this instance. Although, theoretically, if we get this right, we will not need hospitals or pharmaceuticals or an industry that profiteers on us anymore, because like Jesus showed and did and proved to us with his behavior, assuming he existed. Now, I know a lot of people are out there arguing that he didn't exist. I'm crazy enough to be on the side of the argument that I think he did exist, and that now, very early on in the evolution of Christianity, that church got hijacked and everything in the book is corrupt, or most everything in the book is corrupt. Let's say a vast plurality, because I still point to things in the book that I think are not corrupt, that survived somehow in the corruption. But Jesus healed people for free with what, barring an understanding of cosmic energies, could only be called magic. But let's digress. Let's zoom back. This is one of those things that I've been waving the flag on for a long time because I think people don't see it yet. Politics is entertainment. Politics as it is conducted today and as it has been conducted for the last 100 years or so is entertainment. Probably longer. I don't know, maybe forever. Maybe it goes all the way back to the Tower of Babel as well. Because, even when we lived as slaves, we still had government. I mean, when we literally lived as slaves, we still had a group of people that governed over us and tried to entertain us through the act of, taking care of us as slaves. And not much has changed. We've just been given the illusion of freedom in order to, be easier to manage. We live in a time where all of humanity sits dangerously on the precipice of self-destruction because of this conflict of conflicts. And we've been here before, folks, as a family, as a species. Some of us have an intuitive comprehension of that. Some of us are blind beyond blind to it, and that's fine. But arguing about what the best solution is not part of the solution. I don't claim to have the only possible solution. I don't claim to know very much, actually. But I do know this, that meditation heals the mind of the addiction that we all as a species have been, infected with, the addiction to lean towards violence as a tool for solving our problems. That is an addiction that the entirety of humanity is coping with. And I say that as a pacifist, and I say that as someone who, occasionally, humbly pats himself on the back, or sometimes, I let my ego get the better of me and pats himself on the back unnecessarily for having a very minimal expression of violence. And yet I've still fallen for the pit trap of letting my anger and my frustration unleash verbal violence against people that didn't need it. Right? This is where I discovered, this is, dealing with my own anger ballness, as I've talked about before on this show, is what taught me the truth about violence. It was a hard lesson to learn, and I hurt a lot of people along the way, and I lost a lot of friends and former relationship partners because of my lack of comprehension that giving into the frustration and letting my violence be what drives my actions and my thinking and my words only leads to an escalation of violence. And that an escalation of violence will never solve the problem. And that an intellectual understanding of that sentence is nice, but that if you stop there, you will never solve your own problem of anger spiraling out of control and towards either verbal or emotional or spiritual or physical violence. And that no matter how nice or how shy or how nonviolent any of us might self-identify as, we all are struggling and are part of the struggle with this addiction, because we do not exist on this planet alone, separate from each other. The species is networked. Breaking news, folks, and this should break all the news, because once we understand this, we won't need media anymore. And not in an oppressive, it's been taken away from us kind of way, but in a, aha, we can do even cooler, more amazing things. But let me tell you something that I think is, still to this day a little, at this time, even though it's been known for a long time by many, it's still hard for most to wrap their brains around. We are a spiritually, energetically interconnected species. There are metaphysical structures in the universe that we cannot directly perceive with our eyeballs because visible light, the spectrum of information that we do perceive with our eyeballs, is less than a total of, I think, 10%, if not even less than, I think. But it's safe to say that vision and hearing and sight and sound and touch and taste are less than 10% of the available spectrum of information that exists in the universe. There is so much more going on that we can see or hear or listen to or, or comprehend with our apparatus as we are allowed to utilize it today, or as we have been, encouraged or discouraged or oppressed into using it for most of what we call modern history. And that once we liberate ourselves from that oppression, the oppression of our ability to perceive the universe more clearly, that is what's going to empower us as individuals and as communities and as a species to heal ourselves. To heal ourselves spiritually, energetically, and ultimately, at some point, once we really figure out how to do it well, bodily. And there's evidence for this, but I'm not going to go down that rabbit hole right now of arguing whether or not that evidence is real. What I'm saying to you is let's not get trapped in the ego trap of fighting for our revolution, because that is basically just being devoured by Hydra. For those who might be confused, I'm not talking about Hydra from Captain America, although that's a very intelligent use of the symbol. Take note, there's a really valuable lesson both in Civil War and in the other one, I can't remember what it's called, Winter Soldier, about Hydra, because they use that symbol really intelligently. What happens in Winter Soldier? We very, mindfuckedly, or, sort of, some people weren't surprised at all, discover that Hydra was so deeply nested inside of S.H.I.E.L.D. that it was S.H.I.E.L.D. That's going on, folks. That's really real. I mean, I'm not attributing some wisdom or some knowledge to the movie makers. I don't know why they wrote that in there, but let me tell you that resonates with me in terms of what I see in history, and that's that the worst of the worst, those who are oppressing us, are completely deeply wound up in the very systems that we think are the good guys. Ding! I got 4 minutes and 19 seconds left. So yeah, boom. Let's contemplate that. Let's hold ourselves accountable to that. There was a really interesting meme that I engaged, or a post of a meme that I engaged with the Facebook fan on Facebook. Can't remember the exact wording. Don't have it brought up, but it was positing the question: who do we blame? And then it went on at some length about those who are perceived in blame. But I bring it back to this: we can blame society all we want, but we, both at the individual level and at the community level and at the species-wide level, we are society. So we're just blaming ourselves, folks, and not holding ourselves accountable for it. And that's where the meaning of a lot of Buddhist or Zen or transcendental thinking comes in. I think it was Rumi who said, the Sufi poet, who said, yesterday I was something along the lines of, yesterday I was a fool, I wanted to change the world. Today I am wise, and I will change myself. That's the biggest breaking news, is if you want to join the actual effort in solving the actual problem, then you need to disengage from all the pointing fingers and all the laying of blame and all the hating of others and all the fighting against others, and engage in the rediscovering of who you are within yourself, and begin the process of healing your own highly traumatized psychological being, because that's what's going on. That's why we're suffering, folks. That's why we've painted ourselves into this horrible corner. To wake up to all these truths, to help ourselves wake up to all these truths. Okay. And to ultimately learn the lesson. What's the lesson? Well, I've talked about it before, and I'll talk about it again, I am sure. So tune in to Almost Daily Zencast. In fact, going to have a brand new episode coming up in a bit where I'm going to tee off with what is the lesson, and what does that have to do with Jesus' biography, or what I call the prophet phenomenon. Thanks for tuning in to this particular episode of Stuff. I even forgot what title I'm working with today. It's kind of significance, right? Like my meta message is woven into all the shows, and the whole point of making little individual segments is to try to attract different audiences from different cultural themes or niches. But I digress. There's so much more to talk about, and I really would rather be having a conversation with others about this instead of just rambling on my own. So if these themes interest you, join me on social media. In the meantime, until next time, be a good human being. May peace, love, and grooviness blossom in your heart. And go meditate. If you don't know how, check out my meditation series. I've got a couple of starter examples. And if you don't like mine, just type in how to meditate on the internet. There's a million. And as you move forward with that exploration, remember that no matter what anyone else tells you about a meditation, at the core, the activity is self-liberation from ideological constructs. More about that in future segments. Peace, love, and grooviness be with you. Namaste. Thanks for listening. Oh, I had music. I brought it up, but it was still muted. So I needed an assistant. I needed a team. But I rambled about that too. Peace out.